Thank you everyone for joining us. We will begin in just a moment.
And
Welcome everyone to the Disaster Philanthropy Working with Funders to Meet Disaster Recovery Needs session of our Don Hampton Conference and Awards Ceremony. We're happy to have everyone here, and we have a great topic to discuss today. Just a few housekeeping items. I'm Lori Williams. I'll be the room host for this particular session, and if you have any tech issues throughout any time during our session, you can reach out to the tech help in our participants menu. Please utilize your mute buttons and also share any questions, any examples or topics or anything you'd like to put in that chat box. We have a wealth of resources right here in this session with our panelists, so much that they can help offer up. So please use that chat box, put everything in there. As a reminder, this session is being recorded and the recording materials will be available after the conference. And with that, I would like to introduce Carrie Cullen, Director of the Midwest Early Recovery Fund of the Center for Disaster Philanthropy.
Thanks, Lori. And thank you all. I'm really excited to be with you this morning. I'm calling in from Fargo, North Dakota. So I wish that I was in Iowa with you and we were all had the opportunity to be face to face, but it's also nice to be able to call from home. We're in the process of moving. So here we are on a crazy day together. But I'm really excited to talk to you a little bit about the Center for Disaster Philanthropy by the Midwest Early Recovery Fund, but more importantly, to share and have these panelists that we brought together who are funders from Iowa, to have them really just share with you their expertise and hopefully spark some beginnings of some relationships and some collaborations for recovery. So we'll just start with a little context about the Center for Disaster Philanthropy. So the mission of the Center for Disaster Philanthropy is to leverage the power of philanthropy to mobilize a full range of resources to strengthen the ability of communities to withstand disasters and then to recover equitably when disasters occur. And we have three main buckets that we work in at CDP. The first one is educational resources. So most of those educational resources are targeted towards funders and philanthropy with this idea of spreading information about how does the disaster ecosystem work, how can they engage in that ecosystem, what are best practices in funding and grant making, and some of those pieces. Really with this idea, and I'll show you just a stat in a minute, to kind of tip towards what we know is that with disaster, most of the giving comes right away. And most of those dollars go to relief and response. But we really encourage funders and philanthropists to think about not only that early stage, but also the mid to long-term recovery, where we know is the longest time in post-disaster and where the most expense is. Our second bucket is grant making and recovery funds, and that's where I do most of my work as the director of the Midwest Early Recovery Fund. And for that particular fund, I work in a geographical region of 10 states in the Midwest, and Iowa is one of them. And we provide grants and resources to communities across our region who've experienced low attention disasters or a significant impact on marginalized or vulnerable populations in their community. So I come to you today as well as a funder and interested in developing those relationships and collaboration and connection with you. The third bucket that CDP has is consulting, and we work with a wide variety of organizations to help them think about their disaster giving and help them strategize around that. And that section is really what brings most of these panelists to us today. Is CDP has been working in partnership with community foundations across the region in a cohort called the PrEP group. So it's community foundations and partners who are interested in disaster grant making and in disaster philanthropy in the same region as the Midwest Early Recovery Fund. So what do we know about disaster giving? So we know that in the first 4 weeks after disaster, over a third of the private giving has been completed. We also know that in the first 2 months, 2/3 of that giving is done. And after that 6-month mark, almost all of the giving stop. But those of you who are working in disaster, you know that recovery takes much longer than 6 months. And that although most of the funding can come from government sources, sometimes those government sources take a long time and they're complicated. And so philanthropy often fills and can fill that gap for between those fundings and to get recovery really moving and happening for the local community. We also know, and when we think about individuals and households and how they give after disaster, we know that 80% of individual disaster gifts arrive within days after the disaster strikes. So there's a time frame as we're thinking about long-term recovery that really initially we need to start raising funds and raising dollars so that we have the resources that we need in community to support the needs after disaster. We also surveyed individuals and households and asked them why they give after disaster and why they don't give. And most of them give because they have a connection to that community. It's their home that they grew up in. They have family or friends that live there. They've vacationed there. They love that community for some reason. And the majority of them said they don't give is because they've never been asked. They weren't aware of the need and they weren't asked about it. So what do we know about disaster assistance strategies and giving? So this is from our 2018 State of Disaster Philanthropy report. And it says that, if we look at funding across the globe, we know that 50% of the philanthropic funding goes to that response and relief phase. We know that about 12% goes to reconstruction and recovery. And then when we get into preparedness, it's 4%, and resilience, risk reduction and mitigation, we're down to 2%. So like I said at the beginning, CDP's goal is not to move the dollars from response and relief to another place, but to increase the pot so that there is additional dollars available for reconstruction and recovery, for preparedness, for mitigation, and for other needs in the community after disaster. One of the other things I wanted to share is we talk often about this idea that all funders are disaster funders. So when a disaster happens, it tends to fall outside of many foundations and funders' kind of grant-making guidelines. But we know that destruction is multidimensional. So most funders may have a mission or a certain place where their sweet spot, or what they like to fund, or the impact or influence they're trying to make on their communities and on the world. And that would fit into something that is a need after disaster. So housing is an obvious one for us, right? We know that after disaster, there's extreme housing needs often. And so a funder who's really interested in housing, we can kind of make that connection to say, okay, so if you're interested in housing and here's an issue around housing that's happened because of a disaster, perhaps they can begin to think of themselves as a disaster funder as well. So we encourage our donors and the community that we work in to consider not only the full arc of disaster, but the full scope of all of the needs for recovery. Before we get to our panelists, I wanted to share just one resource that we do have available on our website. So when I was working in the nonprofit space as a disaster recovery coordinator in North Dakota, became a really amazing tool for me. You can go in to this website, you can see who's funding in your region, in your area, the kinds of strategies that they are funding, the kinds of interests that they have around disaster. And there's just all kinds of data and information available on this website that would be helpful, that may be helpful for you as you think about fundraising for recovery and kind of what places and who is funding in those spaces. But I'm sure that you've heard this before. I heard this, we talked about this all the time, that you don't want to be exchanging business cards in the middle of an emergency and a crisis. And I would say that that is the same for your interactions with funders and with your interactions with philanthropy. So we're here, we want to have relationship with you. The ladies that are going to talk are committed to their communities. They're participating in their co-eds and VOEDs. They're participating in recovery. And we're here to be in it with you. And so I'm excited to introduce them to you if you haven't met them. Many of you perhaps are already engaged with them as they're working in your community. And I'm excited to learn from them because I think that they have some really great things to share for all of us as we understand disaster funding. Here's my email address real quick, and then I'm going to stop screen share and we're going to turn over to our panelists. But like I said, I'd love to chat with you, have a conversation with you, exchange emails with you, and support you in any way that I can. And I look forward to that opportunity to do that. So I'm going to stop my screen share here. We'll get back to the full screen. Okay, so we're going to start with Carrie Mccann Patel, as she is the president of the Iowa Council on Foundations. And you don't have to be named Carrie to participate in this panel. We have a few others, and I'll prove it as we come along. But for some reason, we have a lot of Carries today. So, but here we go. We're going to start with you, and just tell us a little bit about yourself and your role in disaster philanthropy.
Sure, I'm happy to. Good morning, everyone. My name is Carrie Mccann Patel, president of the Iowa Council of Foundations. We are a statewide membership association serving charitable funders across Iowa or funders outside of Iowa who fund in Iowa. We have just over 70 members, and they represent community foundations, who you'll hear from today, but also private foundations and family foundations, corporate grant makers, and then some intermediary organizations who re-grant charitable dollars on behalf of other programs and state and federal funding sources. So our role is to strengthen and grow philanthropy in Iowa. And we think about that in a variety of different ways, primarily through supporting our members through professional development and training and education around effective grant-making practice, but also in our role in supporting public policy and advocacy on behalf of the sector and on behalf of the nonprofits that our philanthropic institutions support. So those are two of the primary roles. We also wear a hat as the lead philanthropic entity in the state of Iowa, and that's a contract that we hold with the Iowa Economic Development Authority to specifically serve and support community foundations in Iowa. We have two state legislated programs, the Endow Iowa Tax Credit, which many of you may be familiar with, and also the County Endowment Fund program, which distributes a percentage of state gaming tax revenues to the 84 counties in Iowa that do not hold a state issued gaming license. So those partnerships are really important to our community-based philanthropy infrastructure in the state, and we provide training and capacity building supports to help further endowment building at community foundations in support of those state legislated programs. So that's kind of our role in a brief nutshell, but I have also been participating in the prep cohort, first as an employee at a community foundation, and then when I transitioned into this role at the Iowa Council a little over 5 years ago. And our role as a regional association is to think from a statewide perspective, how we can help network and support our members and our community foundations in times of disaster, and how we can leverage our network from a Midwest or a national perspective to connect partners, resources, funding streams, and really think about how we get everyone sort of aligned and moving in the same direction.
Thanks. So just to kind of move on with that a little bit farther, so you work with these community foundations across your state. What can you tell us about the role of a community foundation in their community after disaster? What do you encourage them as they're doing that work?
Yes, well, we've thought a lot about this, in particular in our engagement in the prep cohort. We've received some grant funding to help us develop tools and resources to help community foundations think about this role. You'll hear from some experts in a little bit about the work that they've done in their communities, but our tools have really been designed to help people think about readiness from a community foundation perspective. So they aren't in that reactive space when a disaster does happen, but they've laid the groundwork, they've built the trust with partners, and they're really ready to mobilize and act if a disaster does impact their community. So we produced the Iowa Community Foundation's initiative Disaster Philanthropy Toolkit, and it lays out all those steps to help community foundations feel prepared for a disaster in their community. One of the primary roles that we know community foundations can play in communities, based on their own unique context, of course, is receiving gifts and raising dollars, as you alluded to earlier, Carrie, immediately following the disaster. We know that's when dollars flow. We know that a unique role that community foundations play is in that longer term recovery space. So how can they think about partnerships and state and federal funding sources that are coming in immediately and getting those dollars directed to partners? But then how can community foundations on the back end mobilize their dollars and resources to help for some of those longer term recovery needs that have not been met? You'll hear that in some of the remarks later this morning, I'm sure. So that's a really important way that we help with the readiness of community foundations to support their areas and regions. We also think a lot about our connector role when a disaster does happen. So a great example is the derecho last summer. We knew that it wasn't just one community that was impacted. There were several communities in our network and several of our member partners who were impacted. So we gave them some time and space to sort some things out and get their ducks in a row. And then a few weeks after the derecho, we pulled all of those partners together, really just to share who's got funds open, who is working with FEMA, where are their gaps, how can we help think about coordination of services for those partners, and how can they share best practices and ideas across their communities as well. So it's a lot about that connector role and bringing our network together to do better work together.
Great. Well, and as you're connecting, as you're thinking about the whole scope, what advice would you give to a community that maybe has not yet engaged with their community foundation, or they want to approach somebody that's not, a typical disaster funder? They just want to approach a foundation about gaps in giving. What advice would you give them?
Well, my advice is just to pick up the phone and call and have those conversations and start building those relationships. We know that pays off in the long term if that trusted partnership can be built on the front end. All of our counties in Iowa have at least one community foundation. Many of them serve a full county, but we do have a few that serve specific communities. So I will share a link, or maybe the link will be shared for me to our website that we maintain. It's the iowacommunityfoundations.org website. And that site has an interactive map where you can identify your local community foundation and get in touch with them to start having those conversations. Almost all of them have an annual grant making cycle. Some of them are through that county endowment fund program that I mentioned. So on an annual basis, there's an opportunity to look for and secure support for a variety of needs for nonprofits and charitable causes in your communities. And disaster preparedness could certainly be one of those. So please keep that in mind as a way to have conversations both with your funder about how you can work together, but also about resources that they might have to help support your own disaster planning in your nonprofit or your community more broadly.
Great. Thank you so much. We'll do some questions. I'm sure that there will be some questions. We'll bring you back on here in a little bit, but we're gonna move to Carrie Abbott. Carrie is the Chief Operating Officer of the United Way of Quad Cities. And so we're gonna talk a little bit, we're gonna shift just a little bit and talk about United Ways and their role in the community. So Carrie, would you just introduce yourself, kind of tell us about your role and about the United Way there? Oh, we still got you on mute.
There we go.
There you go.
Good morning, everybody. Like was mentioned, my name is Carrie Abbott, Chief Operating Officer at United Way Quad Cities. We serve Scott County, Iowa, and Rock Island County, Illinois. Our role as a United Way is to provide an avenue for people to give, advocate, and volunteer. So the work that we do in disaster, we mobilize in that way and hope to make the greatest impact possible. So.
Great, thank you. I have found United Ways to be just a great partner as we come into communities and look at how we can provide funds. United Ways is typically a place where we also start new, fresh relationships in communities that we haven't had before. So we've been learning about community foundations and their role, but what is the role of the United Way, especially as it relates to disaster? You touched on it a little bit, but tell us a little bit more.
Right. So what the disaster that I'll use as my example is obviously COVID, is something that we mobilized around pretty quickly, and we did that with our partner in the community foundation, the Quad Cities Community Foundation. And I'm not going to steal Ann's thunder; she comes after me. But obviously, one of the things that we can do is help to raise dollars in a time of disaster. And so with the disaster recovery fund that we have already established in the Quad Cities, we decided early on that we would partner with those efforts, but also know that we have a unique relationship with many companies here in the Quad Cities, in which we have various touch points throughout the year, especially through our workplace campaign. So in addition to that, we also started a COVID rebuilding fund, so that there was the option for donors through the workplace campaign and corporate giving to give to that fund that was meant to be there long after the disaster was here. So that's one of the things we do. We mobilize volunteers. At our United Way, we have a volunteer hub. So we encourage organizations to post their volunteer opportunities there, and then we communicate those opportunities to willing volunteers that are waiting to help in any capacity that they can. We also host our 2-in-1 for Scott County here at United Way, and so helping to provide information and distribute that information was a big thing that we did in COVID and throughout the state with 2-in-1. United Ways played a big part in that. I would say another role that we play is that we can gather information quickly from our local nonprofits, as well as we also did a community-wide survey to get a better idea of what the needs are from the community and how we could designate our dollars to those efforts or those needs. The other thing I think as a funder, which is a big part of what United Way is that we, our role is to be flexible. So when we look at COVID as an example, we were in the middle of our 2-year funding process. We put that on hold in order to listen to the results of that community survey and what we were hearing from our partners, so that we could become more flexible and respond to the actual needs in the community. So I think those are the major things that we've been doing as far as disaster.
So along those lines, as you've been thinking about those initiatives and the things that you've supported, what what's working well? Where are some of your challenges?
So this one's a tough one. Obviously, 2-on-1 is something that we support, and we do that because we know we need to be ready in time of disaster. The challenges with that obviously come with, funding that initiative, as well as keeping the information up to date. You don't need 2-on-1 until you need it. So the challenge is getting organizations to keep that information updated year round. And then obviously making sure that people know that that service is there. And again, that goes to, you don't need it until you need it. So I think that's one thing. I think our volunteer hub is something that's working well, but again, the challenge is keeping that information up to date. One of the things I think that has happened as a result of our work over the past couple of disasters that we've had is that we have a strong relationship here in our community with area funders. And in fact, several of us meet every other week so that we can have that strong relationship and we're ready to respond as quickly as possible. So I think that is really, setting us up for the next disaster so that we're ready to respond.
Great, thank you. Well, we're gonna turn to Anne, and she's one of your partners there in the Quad Cities. So Anne is the Vice President of Development at the Quad Cities Community Foundation, and great to have you with us this morning. If you would just introduce yourself and talk a little bit about your role.
Sure. So I serve as the Vice President at the Quad Cities Community Foundation. We serve Scott County in Iowa and Rock Island County in Illinois, along with the surrounding counties through our rural affiliate program. My role is to help facilitate those charitable gifts to our community and the many worthy efforts across our region in times of disaster and times of not disaster. I have served here since 2017 and have a history as a fundraiser prior to coming here. I would say, so we so appreciate the partnership that we have with our United Way and with those funders that Carrie Abbott had just referred to. That really is a foundation on which all of this work is done, is that we're doing it together for our community together. That's what makes it so strong. We did establish our disaster recovery fund in 2016. It's a forever fund in that it's always there and it always receives gifts for future disasters. And then we kind of activate it when a disaster happens. So the first time we actually activated it was in 2019 for that historic Mississippi River flooding that we had in our region. And that was just shortly after I arrived, and we noticed immediately a flaw in our plan, that it didn't really have fundraising as part of the plan. So we did launch into an immediate fundraising appeal for that purpose, for the floods, based on best practices and knowledge that I brought with me. It wasn't ideal, but we made it work and it was successful. And as soon as that disaster had ebbed, so to speak, we did set about the task of revising our plan. So we had a weighted emphasis on the fundraising portion. And it's a good thing we did, because less than 12 months later, we were back at it again with COVID-19.
Does seem like it has been a never-ending need to raise dollars for disaster and respond and get to what feels like a little bit of an end and start back over, so to speak.
Definitely.
So, yeah. So you've partnered with a lot of organizations, both in raising dollars and in grant making for disaster response and recovery. Talk a little bit more about the benefits of this collaborative work and efforts in these areas.
Sure. Well, I think that any effort that affects the entire community can only be strengthened and made better by those collaborations. So our plan includes those connections that we forge ahead of time with our good United Way partners and our other funders and other organizations that can serve in this capacity. but also with our media, our local civic leaders, other nonprofit organizations, and other community leaders to ensure that when these things happen, we're speaking with one voice and towards one common goal. That's what results in us being able to have the partnership with these other organizations for the grant making side as well. So if the community sees, 10 different organizations all doing their own thing, it kind of dilutes the message and the confidence that people will have in how their money is going to be managed and how the results that are going to happen. So we really lean into bringing together that table where we're all working together, both for fundraising and for grant making and for solving those long-term recovery issues, while leaning into the strengths that each organization partner has. That's really essential for success, because we all bring our own strengths. We got to build on that, let those strengths shine and come together and use them together.
Thank you for that. So I know you work in development and fundraising, not just in disaster, but just for all things. What lessons or tips do you have for others as they're thinking about fundraising, developing recovery resources?
I would say start now. Like, I can't stress that enough. This has to be planned. This part of the whole mechanism has to be planned just the same way you plan how you're going to grant the dollars. You have to plan how you're going to raise those dollars in order to raise enough dollars to make a difference. So things to think about. How will you get the word out? So this is where those relationships you already have established with your media and communication channels, so that you can broadcast widely, that you are a trusted repository for donations, that you have partners working together. Be ready to go with those relationships, to be on the news, be ready for interviews, have a media packet ready so that all the information is readily available and accurate the first time. You don't want to have to go correct a web address. It happens to everybody, but you want to try to get it all up front correctly. You also want to think about, are you going to have some branded materials for your disaster recovery and response fundraising appeal? So if a bank is going to go do, say they'll collect donations at the local fairground, like one of ours did, do you have signage ready to go that they can have to hang up, so that people dropping off those donations are going to know where's their money going to go? And I think you should have a link I provided to our disaster fundraising toolkit. We put together a toolkit. We've got materials. It's all put together on our website. We can activate that at any time. Any local group wanting to do fundraising can go there and they have the basic information. We're not having to dream it up in the moment, because we know what those moments are like. Other things are, how are you going to collect those donations? If it's online, you have to make sure you have a platform for that. You have to decide, are you going to be collecting a fee on that? That's a really big question to answer in advance. There are pros and cons to collecting a fee and not collecting a fee. If it's going to be text to give, what platform do you use, and how are you going to reconcile those donations with your gift processing database? Checks, who's collecting those? Cash, people do cash drive-up drives, drop your money in the bucket, which is wonderful. But you need to have dual controls for counting those dollars and receiving them, so that there's more than just one person sitting at a conference table counting out cash. You want to have those controls and those procedures set up. And what happens if somebody shows up with a bucket of money at your office? We've had that happen. And luckily we did have a procedure in place. If you're going to solicit for matching donations, you need to have a list of donors that you can go to and say, we'd like to ask you to make a leadership gift so we can offer a match. You need to, in terms of outside fundraisers, you'll have groups around the community who want to do a yoga 3-hour yoga-thon. Well, there are safeties and liabilities if they're raising money for one of your funds. So that information needs to be available, and somebody needs to be prepared to manage that. And then reporting mechanisms. You need to have those reporting mechanisms so that you'll be able to pull those fundraising reports, because I promise you 3 days in, somebody's going to come to you and say, can you tell me how many donors, what's the average gift size, what's your totals? You're going to be so overwhelmed by the intake of dollars that you need to have some reporting mechanisms already set up. And then just like with any other donation, stewardship of those dollars is critical. It is really key that you are able to show donors that you use their gifts as you promised. So in your plan, make sure you have included stewardship, how you're going to share those messages, or maybe you don't have to plan it out in specific steps, but at least you need to have mechanisms, and you need to have an outline of these are the different ways we can convey those messages, and we're going to pick the right ones as this disaster continues for a year. And we're going to continue to steward those donors through multiple channels. That is a great way to ensure that when those donors have another disaster in their community, they again are going to look to you as a trusted resource for implementing their own generosity. And then I say the last thing would be just like on a shampoo bottle, rinse and repeat. You're going to review and repeat it. So as one disaster is starting to slow down, you have to stop and review that plan and all your materials while your memories are fresh, and adjust anything that needs to be improved for next time, because there's always something you can learn from every disaster and make it better for next time. And the time to do that is not when the next disaster has started.
Thank you. Those are such practical ideas. And I'll be honest, I haven't looked at your recovery fundraising toolkit, but I'm going to check it out as soon as we're done with this call today and dive into it. Thank you for sharing those resources with us. We really appreciate it. We're going to turn to Jenna. Jenna Mander is the Director of Strategic Relations, the Community Foundation of Greater Dubuque. And Jenna, just introduce yourself. Tell us about your work as it relates to disaster.
Thank you, Carrie. I believe Carrie Patel mentioned earlier that you were going to hear from some experts in disaster, and I wouldn't claim to be an expert by any means, but I have been involved. She mentioned the PrEP cohort, and Carrie also mentioned it earlier, which is a group of community foundations that meet twice a year. And now during COVID, we've actually been meeting monthly and even more regularly. So I've been participating in that cohort for 6 years. And as part of the work in that, when our local community organizations active in disaster, or COAD, which had been what I would consider maybe a sleeping organization, it had been around, but hadn't really had a lot of activity. There was some eagerness to refresh that in late 2015, early 2016, kind of like in case we have a disaster. I became part of the charge leading that effort. And we had responded to a couple low attention disasters in 2018 and 2019 with some flooding, some like flash flooding and windstorms. So I've been part of that, and specifically within that committee, part of our long-term recovery committee, which is what we activated when, as Ann mentioned, the disaster recovery fund. We too have a fund that's always there and available, ready for donations. So we activated ours as well. And then our long-term recovery committee is that group that we pulled together to deploy those assets. So I chair that committee as well.
Which I think that makes you an expert. You've got the experience, and you're sticking with it. You haven't run away yet. So that counts for a whole lot in this field. So this is a little bit more about the PrEP groups, but you've worked and interacted with community foundations across not only Iowa, but across the region. What are one or two things that you've learned about disaster philanthropy that you would think would help this audience better understand funding for recovery?
One of the things, and I feel like it's been mentioned a couple times before, but that immediately comes to mind, is the importance of relationships and trust. Especially, if you have those before the disaster, It's a lot easier to get a fund going, help raise money, help deploy those funds if you have the relationships built. So as I mentioned, we utilized our long-term recovery committee, even with the COVID-19 pandemic, which our committee had been preparing for natural disasters, floods, tornadoes, hadn't really kind of thought of the health long-term impacts. But one of the beautiful things about that group being together already is we were able to pull knowledge from us as the community foundation, our local United Way. We work with our local CAP agency on that committee. We also have a representative from Catholic Charities who's used to doing case management, and a couple other organizations in the community. So we had that kind of knowledge around the table, which was great when we were starting to see applications that we didn't really know enough about to make funding. So we were able to help make some connections as well. So early on in the pandemic, we were getting a lot of food requests. And we were able to connect them to our school district who had some USDA dollars and make them USDA approved sites to help leverage some of the funding that they were receiving. So as we were even thinking about our relief grants, we were also looking for ways for our community to be more resilient long-term. It became fairly obvious early on in the pandemic that we didn't really have a great case management system in the community. If people needed help with housing, they had to jump around to a number of agencies. There definitely wasn't a one-stop shop. And there was also, if you didn't fit kind of the buckets that maybe government dollars checked, you might not have been able to help find funding. So one of the things we did early on was convene some local agencies and said, we'd be willing to pilot a case management position for 2 years if somebody steps into this role. So that's what we had done. They've made some great strides so far. We funded that position, started in November of last year, and so far we have had a homeless hotline. We've always had the homeless hotline, but there's now consistency in its management and a referral-based system. Now, if you're homeless or potentially going to be evicted, you can call the homeless hotline and they refer you to the agency that has availability versus you having to go to each agency on your own. And then similar with food providers, it was a bit of a disconnected network, especially at the beginning of the pandemic when people didn't know if they meet in person, to-go meals, etc. So we started convening the food providers in the community and still convene them twice a week to really talk about, who's providing meals, what can we do to make that process better for recovery. And a couple exciting things that have happened that a lot of the grants we had from the Disaster Recovery Fund is this COVID related or not? We really looked at how we could empower those organizations long beyond recovery, especially if they're going to have, if we have another disaster, we want them to be up and running. We don't want to have to provide another case management position. We'd already just fund the current case management position. So with our food pantry, they were relying on a number of elderly volunteers. With COVID, a lot of those volunteers didn't feel comfortable. So we were able to fund a lift in the food pantry that helped lift food from a basement to the main floor to lessen the need for volunteers. Our rescue mission, which is one of our, not only just a homeless shelter for men, but also provides food sites, had noticed that there were not hot meals in certain neighborhoods. So they had applied for a grant for a local food truck, which they now take into the neighborhoods and provide hot meals. And then also on weekends, they just started using it locally to raise funds. So every meal sold then goes back to the food truck for them to provide other meals. More recently, also, we've provided them funding for a mobile bunkhouse since their shelter had been full. And this will also be able to deploy if we were to have other natural disasters. And we didn't quite have a FEMA trailer or Red Cross Salvation Army trailer. We do have that resource now locally. So we've been trying to look at, in each of our grants, we obviously need to fund immediate needs, housing, food, etc. But we've been trying to look for those small ways that we can help build back better.
great. Those sound like very flexible and needs driven. So you're finding out what the needs are and trying as best as you can to meet them as that's available. So I noticed that you have some communications experience in your background. So this question is just really about tips and ideas that you have for communication about post-disaster funding needs. What might be helpful for this audience?
So this was an interesting question that I really thought about, and we, especially in the pandemic, almost started thinking about our post-disaster funding almost immediately. So when we started communicating about our disaster recovery fund, we were blessed that our community really pulled together and raised funding. In total, we've raised about 1.9 million. About 1.4 million came within the first couple months. And we were meeting twice a week to deploy those funds, but not nearly at the rate we were raising them. And there was a lot of pushback in the community of, you're sitting on $1.4 million, you've granted out $700,000, what's going on? So we started looking internally, and one of the things we stopped doing was communicating how much we raised, not to take away that to hide the fact that we had raised that money, but because people weren't really understanding why we were sitting on it. So if you think about it, in a natural disaster, an organization like Red Cross and Salvation Army, they're probably going to fund your immediate relief. So we were trying to play the long game and work on recovery. So we were willing to look at, housing, food, and any immediate needs that had come up. But now we're starting to think about, and we just had we started meeting twice a week at the beginning of the pandemic. We just switched to meeting every 2 weeks, 2 months ago. So now to have those couple hours back in your week has been huge. So in our meeting just yesterday, we started talking about, there's about $200,000 left in that fund. As Ann mentioned, it's a fund that's always there and can be accessed during low attention disasters. So I mentioned that windstorm and the flash flooding that we had accessed the fund for in 2018 and 2019. We weren't able to raise new money. Like those disasters, when you communicate for disaster fundraising, you have to really tug at the heartstrings, and they didn't impact enough people to really tug at the heartstrings and be able to raise funds. But we still needed to deploy those funds to the people in need. So we talked a lot about, what's going to be that balance that we remain in the fund, but also what does recovery from a disaster look like? So immediately you need housing and you need food, but you actually had it perfect on your slide earlier, Carrie. You had that holistic approach. It was a little chart, and you had food and housing in 2 sections, and then you had education and mental health in the other 2 sections. And that's exactly where we're at right now. We're working with community organizations to really look at the long-term impacts, especially of the pandemic. But those are usually long-term impacts of a natural disaster, especially the mental health and the brain health needs. So we are still, I don't know that I have the perfect answer to communicating about post-recovery needs, but we are certainly looking more at brain health and education. And I don't know that we're doing a great job communicating with our donors as we are communicating with the local nonprofits. So this past couple of weeks, we've been spending a lot of time. We got the data from our school district, and K through 6 range anywhere from a 4 to 19% reading loss this year. Most of them average 7 to 9% in the grades. So really looking at how are we going to get those kids back even to meeting the grade level before they go to the next grade level. So starting to work kind of behind the scenes on that. We've also been doing a lot in the brain health arena, and not necessarily targeting people who you think have, had pre-existing brain health needs prior to the pandemic. We're really looking at people who, might have had long-term unemployment, kids who were home and didn't necessarily have the supports they needed. We're trying to be creative in how we think about those target populations, and communicate with them and say there is still funding available. We did keep that funding. just for these needs. So we're trying to be diligent. $200,000 sounds like a lot of money, but when we think about like just even that education and summer learning, that could potentially be up to $60,000. So we're really looking at how to continue to address those needs. And it was hard to articulate those savings in the beginning, but we needed to be at this point that we're at now.
That idea is a really, really valuable learning, I think, for all of us. To how do we communicate like why we maybe quote look like we're sitting on dollars, because we know best practices, we know the future in some senses, right? We know that there's more expenses to come. And I also love that you're thinking about what happens after recovery, and being prepared for the next event that may occur. That sometimes we talk about them as not being very sexy, right? So there's not a lot of interest in giving to them, but we know the needs are still there. So yeah, thank you for all that great information. We're going to turn to the last but not the least of the Carries, Carrie Walker. Carrie is the nonprofit network manager at the Greater Cedar Rapids Community Foundation. So Carrie, I'll just give it to you for an introduction and a little bit about your role in disaster.
Awesome, thanks, Carrie. Yes, I am the nonprofit network manager at the Greater Cedar Rapids Community Foundation. And so I have been part of the disaster philanthropy and grant making team for about the last 4 years. I also work on a team that has extensive background in disaster work due to our 2008 flood in the Cedar Rapids area, and our 2016 flood, and then obviously COVID and the most recent derecho that we had in August of last year. So I have worked again with the disaster work in our organization through training opportunities. I also was the coordinator of the disaster preparation project that we held several years ago for non-metro Linn County to encourage disaster preparation. And then most recently, I have been the coordinator of the COVID-19 Disaster Response Fund. And like I said, the Disaster Recovery Fund due to the August derecho last year.
So, with that, as that nonprofit relationships and network for the greater community in Cedar Rapids and surrounding areas, and you just mentioned in the midst of pandemic recovery as well as in the midst of derecho recovery. So, what have you learned about disaster funding, either from these newest ones that are popping up or in the history that would be helpful for this audience?
Yeah, I've learned so much that I could probably talk for way longer than I should. So I'm going to try to focus on a couple of different areas. One is the swift response that is needed during a disaster. And so I think Anne talked about, the planning, and if, that when you're involved in a disaster, time seems to go so quickly and you have so much to accomplish. And so when the derecho came through on Monday, August 10th in our community, it was so widespread that the lights and sirens phase took a lot longer than like a normal natural disaster. So, there was extensive debris. There were power outages throughout a lot of Linn County, which is our service area, and where Cedar Rapids is located, and Marion, which was also hit very hard. And there were really serious communication challenges because a lot of the cell phone usage was not available. So it took a lot longer, I think, to identify the seriousness of the situation because of those communication challenges. So every time I think about that time frame, I think about the swiftness of our staff to not only deal with damage to their properties, but also understand that there were people in need that our organizations, our partner organizations were serving, that we really wanted to help. And so I look at this timeline every time to remind myself and to like convince myself that it actually happened. But the derecho hit on Monday, August 10th at between 12:30 and 1:30 p.m. in the afternoon. We had our fund set up on Thursday, August 13th, despite all of the challenges that I mentioned earlier with communication. We had our lead donors and program team working to identify the gaps in funding, what were the immediate human needs. That's where we wanted to go first. And by Monday, August 17th and Tuesday, August 18th, we were printing and delivering checks to address those human needs. So I'm really proud of our team for being able to overcome some of those challenges and process donations, identify those immediate needs, and be able to print and deliver checks. Some of those immediate needs that we identified, food and supplies, because there was no power, fuel was difficult to find, cleaning supplies, those types of things. There was trauma associated with the wind event, which we have heard is very common with wind events in disaster. And then we had several populations that were affected through their housing being destroyed. One of those being a large immigrant population that had their housing destroyed. And so just trying to get out funding so that those organizations that work with those and have trusted relationships with the people can do the work and can go and serve those communities. And then the second thing that I'll say, so the swift response is something I've learned. And the second thing I will say is just the relationships that we have formed. Our local community action group is called LAPAID. It's Lynn Area Partners Active in Disaster. And it was a group formed following the 2008 floods that Cedar Rapids experienced and Lynn County area. And so it was actually activated due to COVID-19. And so there were groups that we were already meeting to talk about disaster recovery. And so, that was something that could really be continued through those partnerships. And then really soon after, I think there was a meeting on Friday after the disaster, and shortly after that, the resource centers were set up in the neighborhoods where they identified need. And all of those partnerships that were created with LAPAID helped provide food, emergency supplies, mental health care, access to resources, and help with what to do next with people that were wondering, what do I do next? So 10 days after the disaster, we, as a staff, visited those centers, talked to the people there, tried to have conversations about what were the volunteers seeing, what needs were being met through the resource centers, where were there gaps in funding that needed to be filled. And so collecting the information from your partners is so important, and having those relationships that you can call on people. We had a lot of conversations those first weeks with agencies and organizations that we work with. The community foundation, our community foundation is a funder throughout multi-sectors. So that's something that has been interesting about disaster funding, is that we really have focused a lot on human needs because that role is important to identify after the disaster, what human needs do we need. And so we've really focused on that and talking with organizations that are helping to fill those roles.
Yeah, and so I think everybody's touched a little bit about this, but just kind of to think about what is it, or maybe even just thinking about, the future, right? Unfortunately, this is probably not the last disaster that your community will face. What about preparing for that? How are you thinking about and encouraging organizations as they're thinking about preparing for recovery and funding issues?
Yeah, it's so challenging for organizations. We were talking about earlier, having a plan for what you will do. And that's a crisis plan. What is your organization how is your organization going to handle? I don't think any of us could have been fully prepared for what happened in 2020. First of all, living through a pandemic, and then experiencing a natural disaster that was so widespread. We were talking about in 2008, there was a flood, and it impacted a lot of people. It was a FEMA declared disaster. It impacted a lot of people. But the derecho was, everyone I knew that lived in our town had some type of damage, either to their home or their neighborhood or their business or, their cousin or their friend. It was just so widespread. It was, I just don't, now we know, I guess, what to prepare for next time, and to the lessons that we've learned. So I think, reflection on what have we learned over the last year. I think that will be interesting to think about how I can help lead that in my role and as the nonprofit network manager when I work with our peer groups that we hold for nonprofit professionals, talking about, some of the reflection, which we have done over the last year. We've talked about what is the reflection, where are we at this time? There's a psychological graph that many of you probably have seen about what happens after disaster, and there's a disillusionment phase. And I think that is where we are right now. It feels like it's been a long time. There's still so many needs. We have gotten some funding out to a large group of funding to help support housing needs, because those have just emerged as housing repairs as one of the greatest needs that we have in our community right now. So, plan what you can, I guess, is my advice. Plan for what you can, and then just be ready to react and to reflect on the lessons that you've learned. So that's what we will be doing as an organization also. And then the other advice that I have, really just for other communities throughout, is to understand when it comes to fundraising, understand who is going to be in charge, who is holding your fund. We have funds here in our area at the Community Foundation. We also have funds at United Way. United Way of East Central Iowa also has a disaster recovery fund. So we work together as funders. We have a funders group that meets. We work with the Alliant Energy Foundation. So we have a group of funders that really is interested in doing the best work we can with the philanthropic dollars that we have, and to try to fill those gaps, and to do that together is more impactful than we can do on our own. So when I talk to some of our non-metro communities, I talk to them about who is going to hold your fund. Is it, are you going to use a platform like GoFundMe? If so, how? Who's going to be in charge of it? Are you going to partner with the Community Foundation, or are you going to utilize United Way, or are you going to use a local bank and a partner that you have within your town? Great, just have a plan and know, because I talked about that quick response. That's what's important, is where the funds are going to happen. Carrie showed the slide about when the funds come in, so we have to be ready. Because one of the other things is that a lot of recovery can't be done on your own as a community. I think that's something that we've learned from the Center for Disaster Philanthropy, is you need resources and you need people that care about communities throughout. We received donations for the derecho from all 50 states. And that is going to be a key to helping our community recover. And so, having those relationships ready having a plan of who's going to host your fundraising, how you're going to work together. And it's not going to be perfect. And you probably, you know, there's going to be different things thrown at you and you're going to have to adjust. And I feel like, you know, that's what we've done over the last year. And so that's, you know, again, back to your first question, that's what I've learned over the last year. Be prepared for what you can't imagine.
Thank you, Carrie. You, you have been through quite the last, over a year. And so, and have just done, watching from a distance, have just done a phenomenal job with meeting those needs and being flexible and moving things as quickly as possible, but with some really strategic and thoughtfulness around this. And similar to, you know, as Jenna talked about, you know, how do we communicate when we know that there's human needs right now, but we also know that there's additional needs that are going to come. Would you, I know this wasn't, you know, part of the plan, but would you talk a little bit about that kind of idea and how you communicate immediate needs versus long-term needs?
Yeah, I think that, you know, that was one thing that we're actually still talking about, because when you have dual disasters, like we are still experiencing, you still have human needs, because we are still in a disaster with a pandemic that created all types of, you know, human needs. And then when you add on a natural disaster to that, you are going to have human needs. And so we've relied a lot on, you know, previous experience with our 2008 flood and our grant programs that came after that. Again, I think Jenna talked about just our long-term recovery plans and goals, and knowing that we are here to try to fill those gaps as they come. There's going to be funding that comes in, you know, from different areas, but we want to be able to address some of those needs. So like I said, we did fund a large grant, actually in partnership with United Way of East Central Iowa, and to continue the patch program, which has been working on patching, basically housing for homeowners, and then also providing a revolving loan fund for people that really need to get their homes fixed. And so so that process is also going. And those were all created by partners that we have, like by nonprofit organizations that came together, you know, through LAP aid partnerships, through other partnerships that said we can address these needs. And so our funder, you know, the funder's role is to say, okay, what do you need? Tell us, you know, how you're going to do it, and then let us try to fill the gaps in funding that you need. That was kind of a long answer.
That was a perfect answer. I love that. It's that idea that you know, for me as a funder, we're working at getting to yes, right? So if you, if somebody comes to me with a need, I am working at getting to yes. And if I can't figure it out, I am also relying on the network of other funders and other nonprofits and other groups, right? In those relationships that we have developed across the board, across the country, to see if we can figure out how to do that. Because like you, I feel like we're in this together. We're here. We're part of making this happen, and we don't want anyone to ever feel like they're alone in this process, right?
And I think that's like maybe one thing that people don't understand is that the community foundation, specifically, our role is to support the nonprofits that are doing that work. So, you know, it isn't our role to send out $50 to, you know, someone in need. Our role is to help our nonprofit organizations stay strong, stay resilient, to provide them with resources so that they can fulfill their missions and carry out that work. So I think that's maybe one thing people, you know, on a wider level don't understand, is that, you know, that's our funder role, is to like empower all of those nonprofits that really do the amazing work.
Absolutely. Thank you. So we're gonna bring, if we could, just bring everybody from all the panelists back on the screen, and love to see some additional questions in the chat. But before we do that, is there anything anybody wanted to add that they didn't get a chance to say yet, or a comment that would, yeah, you would just like to add it? Now's your chance.
Speak a little bit, Carrie, about I know Glenn put in the chat about our targeted outreach to immigrants, and we got to admit that we had a network specifically targeting an immigrant needs assessment, so we had an advantage going in with back to the power of relationships going into the pandemic with immigrant communities, that I think we were able to uniquely address some of their needs. So very early on, we had identified that many of our food providers weren't providing culturally appropriate food to our immigrant populations. So we were able to, a local group of volunteers had pulled together and did just that. They had addressed different population needs in the community, and then assembled food boxes specific to those individuals. And because there was also a fear of going out into the public, they delivered those food boxes to the doors of the homes that they were aware of, which eventually, there's a lot of word of mouth that travels to the immigrant community, so they were able to build that network. And we feel we were able to identify the food needs fairly well. In addition, we had early on with the different stimulus packages that had been sent out, we definitely noted that many immigrant families were not eligible for those CARES funding and Stimulus Act funding. So we had carved out some disaster recovery funds where other homeowners might have been capped at $500 to $750 per household for some of the programs in the community. They had done some pretty specific outreach using a variety of partners like our Presentation Lantern Center, Catholic Charities with their immigration legal attorneys, to try to identify homes that needed assistance, and also the number of people in the homes, because many immigrant families live in multi-group. Might look like a single family home, but there could be 3 or 4 families living there. So we're able to tailor some of our housing assistance in that way. When it comes to food security and the culturally sensitive foods, that's one thing we're still trying to figure out a sustainable solution to. We had offered about probably end of last summer to try to help that volunteer group that really emerged to get their own 501c3. They were like, yeah, we don't want no part of that. So now we're trying to work with different food groups to see, how can we incorporate culturally sensitive food items into different programs. We also have a large Pacific Islander, specifically Marshallese population in Dubuque. And there was a local doctor who had started a GoFundMe page early on in the pandemic for the Marshallese population's healthcare needs, and had realized that he didn't necessarily have the resources to deploy those funds, and had ended up moving that fund and ultimately the fundraising to the community foundation. So we were able to raise $100,000, almost, it was like 99 and change, specifically for the long-term health of the Marshallese population. And besides some individual needs that we had addressed, we had also looked at, we had helped turn one of the churches in the Marshallese community into a site for them. I'm drawing a blank on the word now, but a site for them to house if they were an isolation site, because so many of the Marshallese family, again, live in group quarters, but they also have cultural needs. So we were able to help turn one of the churches into an isolation site, and then also help provide food for the Marshallese students. We had one specific nonprofit provider who every day had their typical lunches, and then also lunches geared towards the Marshallese health needs, and then a number of translation services that were needed in the community, especially around the hospitals. and the needs there. So we tried to target those. And then I don't know that I would necessarily 100% correlate this to the pandemic, but we've also started to look at some of our immigrant populations and get them more connected to services in the community. So we've been able to hire through our local VNA, our Visiting Nurses Association, a Marshallese community connector, whose job is really to meet with Marshallese individuals and really get them connected to resources in the community. And also we have a large population of unaccompanied Guatemalan minors. So we have worked with the local community college to hire a Guatemalan mentor because we found that they don't speak, when most people would think they would speak Spanish, they speak a Mayan dialect. So to help kind of with that additional translation there. So they translate to Spanish and then to English for those individuals. So some things that we were able to do that a pretty vulnerable population that doesn't make up a huge percentage of our community, but enough of our community to make a difference.
Great, thank you. Jenna, when you talk, what I hear in that is that your role, and I would extend that probably to the United Way, is really as that community connection, right, to all of these different places where work needs exist and where work can happen. And you really play kind of a central role to the spokes, so to speak, of community and needs. So thank you for sharing that. Lori, I will turn it over to you for questions for the group and the audience, from the audience. So.
Absolutely, thank you. So we've had two questions that have not yet been answered that came through on the chat. You guys did a great job of actually answering questions that you didn't even know were coming through. So excellent information. So one of the questions that came through is regarding multiple disasters continuing to happen. And the question is, how can organizations maintain consistent funding for one disaster if another disaster follows soon after? How do you maintain attention on the initial disaster and balance between the two? And I think I was going to kind of call out one of you to answer it, but you guys, knowing each other might be better suited to suggest who might be best equipped to answer that question.
I will let somebody else provide a longer answer, but my short-term answer is that we know that a lot of our community foundations are keeping their disaster philanthropy funds open in the long term. So it is always there. It is always active. It is always accepting gifts for moments like this, when there are dual disasters and funds need to be applied to a variety of different causes. So I think that was a key learning in the prep cohort. Instead of opening an individual fund for each disaster, opening that comprehensive fund that can be sort of a reserve coffer that people can tap into when disasters strike. And I know many of the partners on the phone, that's how they operate their funds. So I might let one of them chime in about how that looks in actuality.
I'll quickly add to Carrie's comment, but then I think Carrie Walker might, she actually has a lived experience of the dual disaster. And I would just add one comment to Carrie, is that we had that experience in 2017, I think it was, when McGregor had their tornado. We opened a McGregor Tornado Relief Fund, which was great. It raised somewhere between $65,000 and $70,000. However, we quickly learned that there's a lot more insurance that can step in a tornado than probably steps in a flood. And we just weren't able to deploy those resources as we had originally intended for that community as a response to the tornado. So they've had some creative ways and things they're still doing in green space and some other things that they're doing. But because we had specifically named and raised that fund under McGregor's name, we didn't feel comfortable maybe opening that up to the entire Clayton County, which is the county that McGregor's in, or had there been a flood, deploying it for that. So that was definitely a lesson learned for us, was to keep kind of those multiple disasters in mind.
Yeah, I was just going to echo that also, both what Jenna and Carrie said is that was also a lesson that we opened a COVID-19 specific response fund at the beginning of 2020, and then moved to a disaster recovery fund that will be our standing fund from now on. So, so yeah, again, a lesson learned that makes it, again, more streamlined to be able to respond quickly. Like, one of the lessons that I would offer everyone is to make it easier on yourselves to be able to respond quickly. And that's one of the tools that we've used also.
Great, thank you for those answers. So this next question, before I ask it, I just want to open up to our audience. If you have our participants, if you have any additional questions, feel free to pop them in the chat box. We do have a couple more minutes to take some more questions if you have them, so don't be shy. So the last question that I have on my end right now is, as you seek to support the organizations providing services after disaster, especially looking at further down the line into that recovery period, what would you like those organizations to know for them to be prepared for working with you? And we'll open that for whomever would like to respond.
I can just give a brief overview of what we did following the derecho. So we have those immediate needs grants that I spoke about earlier. We then opened up an application process where it was a very simple 1 to 2 page application for human needs. What do you need to continue serving people? And so that process was then obvious, and then also reviewed by a grant committee. So you know, any organization that was filling a human need related to the derecho could apply for funding. And then in probably the last 3 to 4 months, we've focused on systems grants. And that's, like I said, like I talked about with our partnership with United Way of East Central Iowa and our funders group, including Alliant Energy Foundation. So what systems you need support? And so that's, again, where that housing, we also, I think, addressed maybe food insecure. I'm trying to think of all the things that we've done, but housing was the main thing. And so the systems grants, then who as a group are working together to serve a specific need. Oh, and then the other thing that we're also focused on funding, I think Jenna mentioned this, or a few people, is those staff positions that are doing the work. So the long-term recovery navigator, you know, the case managers. So those are the people, again, that are fulfilling that mission. So I'll make it short so that hopefully someone else can chime in too. But that's how we organized our most recent grant programs.
And Carrie, really quickly, we did have a chat that was just sent over to me as a follow-up to yours. How did you get those applications out? Directly through a case management process, or some curiosity there on that approach, so organizations can be looking for where those are coming from?
So I think maybe the question is, how did we communicate the opportunity for funding? And that would be through as many channels as possible. So please be on, you know, if you're a Lynn County nonprofit, please be on our email list. And then also we would have a lot of those human needs partners are also funded by other grant programs. And so, you know, that list is going to be really important for us to reach out to also.
I would add back to the original question, for organizations not to hesitate to reach out. We tried to make ourselves as easy to work with as possible in this process. I think our grant application it started as 3 questions. As we got a little further in the pandemic and organizations were starting to come back, we added a 4th question, which is just, how did you use the funds we've already given you? And it was optional for anyone we had funded. And we also are happy to take phone calls. So this past week, I've had 3 calls. Hey, we're thinking about doing this. it's been really a great change from kind of that more relief to a recovery and resiliency. We're thinking about this. Do you think it applies to the disaster recovery fund? And I think it's helped us take a look at our grant making as a whole. We were requiring grant reports with all of our grants, that competitive grant processes that we had. And early on in the pandemic, we made a conscious decision not to request grant reports from our disaster recovery fund grants, but more so an openness for conversation. So if we call and just need a couple quick data points, or if we send a check-in, could you just share quick data? That way we can send that out to our donors. Where we found that the most beneficial was with our food providers, who didn't quite know the volume that they were going to be tapped into the first couple months of the pandemic. And there were days that I was on the phone with our food bank, and she was like, I work 12 hours a day. I couldn't even imagine trying to get you guys a grant report, so I was eligible for the next round of funding. So I would say that we, feel free to reach out to us, but also if there are other ways that you're like, if, we didn't have a required budget template, just send us how you are going to use the funds. That we are trying to be better grant makers and not make everybody fit into a mold that they don't necessarily fit into.
I'll just add one thought onto that. I think the perception of traditional philanthropy is that you have to come with an idea and a solution to a problem, and that does not apply in disaster philanthropy work. Bring the problem, and community foundations and United Ways and funders can be not only investment partners, but thought partners in helping get some of those solutions to your community. You've heard so many examples of how that has happened through collaborative partnership and networking. So, to Jenna's point of don't be afraid to pick up the phone, but also don't feel like you have to have the solution. You can call with an issue or a need that you're seeing in your community and think together in partnership about how best to solve that.
Great input, great ideas there. I believe that's all the questions I have that have come my way. I'll just open up for a moment for anyone else who has a question. You can drop it in the chat box or come off mute and ask it as well. And not hearing any others, I'll just sort of hand it back to you, Carrie Cullen, if there's any final words.
I'll just end by just saying thank you to all of these ladies for participating and bringing their expertise and their thoughts to the panel. I really appreciate it. I really appreciate the partnership that we've had. And to those of you who are participating, I hope that you saw today, one, that we're not scary. We are approachable, and we would love to, just like was just said, we'd love to be in it with you. So come to us with your needs, and let's have that conversation. And again, we're looking to get to yes to help come up with solutions. And so if it's not us, we do have a network that we work with regularly to do that. So I know the emails were put in the chat, and we would welcome those conversations in the future. So.
Thank you to all of our panelists for sharing your wealth of information, taking our questions. I hope we'll have lots of further conversations down the line. I would ask for our participants if you'll take a moment to complete our feedback survey that Ashley has dropped into the chat box. That would be wonderful to hear that from everyone. And next, looking ahead in our schedule for today, we'll have a makeup session of the Youth Mental Health and Disasters Resilience in and Through the Storm session coming up here at 12:15. This will be a shortened session, inviting Paul Daniel to return to us after the technical difficulties during his session. You're welcome to stay logged in during Zoom, and we'll just move you into the wait room in between the sessions. And thank you everyone for joining us today.